What if everything we know about Atlantis is wrong? What if the lost civilization never called itself Atlantis at all? What if its traces are scattered across myths from South America to India, hidden under names like Islands of the Gods, Land of the Ancestors, or Drowned Worlds? We have grown accustomed to perceiving Atlantis solely through Plato's accounts. But many cultures possess similar legends about mysterious lands that sank beneath the waves, about sea-dwelling visitors, about islands that vanished without a trace. This means that Atlantis might not have been merely a Greek story, but a global memory of something real or archetypal. We embark on a journey through 10 ancient texts and myths from different corners of the world, and attempt to find within them the shadows of Atlantis, though it is never named as such. The question that haunts us is not whether Atlantis existed, but whether humanity has been telling the same story in different languages, preserving the memory of something so profound that it transcended borders, cultures, and millennia. The silence surrounding its true name might be the most telling clue of all. Historical context: the birth of a legend. The emergence of the Atlantis idea traces back to Plato in the 4th century BCE, who created a description of a gigantic island that perished suddenly. Yet this represents merely the tip of an iceberg that extends far deeper into the murky waters of human memory. Ancient texts and legends exist that do not mention Atlantis directly, but describe similar events or geography with startling consistency. These narratives served as the foundation for cosmogony, geography, and moral instruction among diverse peoples, from the indigenous tribes of the Americas to the Maya, from the ancient Egyptians to the Vedic sages of India. The cultural role of these texts cannot be overstated. They were not merely stories told around fires or philosophical allegories crafted for entertainment. They were the bedrock upon which entire civilizations built their understanding of the world's origins, their place within cosmic order, and their relationship with the divine. Each culture that preserved these accounts did so with reverence, passing them down through generations as sacred knowledge rather than mere folklore. Recent archaeological discoveries have led researchers to turn increasingly toward non-classical sources. The Indian Vedas with their descriptions of cosmic floods, Chinese chronicles that speak of vanished island kingdoms, Egyptian papyri that reference western lands swallowed by the sea. These texts, previously dismissed as mythology, are now being examined with fresh eyes by scholars who recognize that ancient peoples often encoded historical memories within their spiritual narratives. The Egyptian records speak of Zep-Tepi, the first time, when gods ruled directly on earth before withdrawing to celestial realms. The pyramid texts and coffin texts allude to a primordial land in the west, beyond the known world, where the souls of the dead would journey. This western realm, associated with the god Osiris and the setting sun, was described as an island paradise that existed before the Great Flood that reshaped the world. In India, the Matsya Purana and other ancient texts describe the destruction of the world by flood, with only a few survivors preserving the knowledge of the previous age. The Mahabharata contains references to underwater cities and advanced civilizations that existed before the current age of humanity. These accounts describe not just physical destruction, but the loss of spiritual knowledge and technological capabilities that had to be rebuilt from fragments. The Maya creation myth, as recorded in the Popol Vuh, tells of multiple previous worlds that were destroyed by the gods, with the current world being the 4th or 5th iteration. Each previous world was inhabited by different beings, and each was destroyed when it failed to properly honor the divine. The accounts describe great floods, darkness, and the sinking of lands, with only a few survivors escaping to begin anew. Chinese historical records from the Han Dynasty describe islands far to the east where immortals lived in palaces of jade and gold. These accounts were not considered mythological by the Chinese court, but were serious enough to warrant imperial expeditions in search of these lands. The chronicles describe these islands as having been accessible in ancient times but later becoming hidden or sunk beneath the waves. The common threads running through these diverse traditions are striking. Advanced civilizations that possessed great knowledge and technology, moral corruption that led to divine punishment, catastrophic floods that destroyed entire continents, and the survival of only a few individuals who carried the memory of what was lost. These elements appear with such consistency across cultures that had no known contact with each other that they suggest either a common source or a shared human experience of such magnitude that it became embedded in our collective memory. What makes these accounts particularly intriguing is their specificity. They do not speak in vague terms about long ago or in ancient times, but often provide detailed chronologies, geographical descriptions, and even astronomical alignments that can be verified. The Egyptian accounts place their lost western land at a specific location relative to the Nile Delta. The Indian texts provide detailed descriptions of the geography and climate of the lost lands. The Maya creation accounts include astronomical references that can be dated to specific periods in the distant past. The pattern of loss and rediscovery is another common element. Each culture describes not just the destruction of the previous world, but the gradual recovery of knowledge and civilization over many generations. This suggests that the memory of these events was not merely mythological, but represented a real historical process of cultural collapse and renewal that ancient peoples experienced and documented. Perhaps most significantly, these texts consistently describe the lost civilizations as having possessed knowledge and capabilities that exceeded those of the cultures that preserved their memory. The Egyptian texts speak of the gods of the first time as having powers of creation and destruction that later pharaohs could only aspire to. The Indian texts describe the previous ages as having possessed flying vehicles, advanced weapons, and knowledge of the cosmos that was later lost. The Maya accounts describe the previous worlds as having been inhabited by beings of great power and wisdom. This pattern suggests that the memory of Atlantis, or whatever historical reality it represents, was not simply the creation of Plato's imagination, but was part of a much broader human tradition of remembering and honoring a lost golden age. The fact that these memories were preserved across such diverse cultures, in such similar forms, points to something far more significant than coincidence or cultural borrowing. The silence of history regarding the true name of this lost civilization becomes, in this context, not an absence of evidence, but evidence of a deliberate forgetting. The consistent pattern of destruction followed by the loss of names, records, and specific details suggests that whatever catastrophe befell this ancient civilization was so complete that even its name was erased from most records, surviving only in the encrypted form of myth and legend. The vanishing, when worlds disappear. The motif of the vanished land appears in virtually every culture mentioned in these ancient texts, creating a haunting pattern of remembrance that spans continents and millennia. This is not merely the disappearance of a city or a kingdom, but the obliteration of entire civilizations, empires, and what the texts consistently describe as divine civilizations, societies that had achieved a level of development so advanced that they were considered to bridge the gap between the human and divine realms. The chronology of the lost reveals a disturbing consistency across cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. In Egypt, the land in the west vanishes after a cataclysm that the texts describe as both a punishment for hubris and a cosmic necessity for the renewal of the world. The Edfu texts speak of a time when the primordial island, home to the Neteru or gods, was swallowed by the waters in a single day and night. The survivors of this catastrophe are described as traveling to Egypt, where they became the civilizers of the Nile Valley, teaching the arts of agriculture, writing, and sacred architecture. China's ancient chronicles preserve memories of an island culture beyond the known world, far to the east in the vast ocean. The Shanhai Jing, or Classic of Mountains and Seas, describes islands inhabited by immortals who possess the secret of eternal life. These accounts are not presented as fantasies, but as geographical descriptions of real places that existed in the distant past. The texts describe these islands as having been accessible to ancient Chinese mariners, but later becoming hidden or sunk beneath the waves due to changes in the cosmic order. The Indian tradition presents perhaps the most detailed account of the Great Flood in the Manusmriti and other Puranic texts. The destruction is described not as a single event, but as a cyclic process that marks the end of each cosmic age. The texts speak of Dvarka, the golden city of Krishna, which was swallowed by the ocean after Krishna's departure from the earth. But beyond this well-known account, the texts also describe much earlier civilizations that were destroyed by cosmic floods, leaving only fragments of their knowledge to be preserved by the sages. The Maya creation myth presents a particularly complex understanding of cyclic destruction and renewal. The Popol Vuh describes multiple previous worlds, each inhabited by different kinds of beings, and each destroyed when they failed to properly honor the creators. The gods are described as coming from the water initially, bringing the knowledge of civilization to humanity. But these same divine beings are also described as departing, returning to the waters when the world becomes corrupt, taking with them the fullness of their wisdom and leaving only traces behind. The first reactions to these disappearances, as recorded in the ancient texts, reveal a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between moral corruption and cosmic consequence. In many cultures, the vanishing is interpreted as karma, a cosmic balancing that becomes necessary when civilizations reach a certain level of spiritual degradation. The Egyptian texts describe the inhabitants of the lost Western land as having become proud and forgetful of their divine origins, leading to their destruction as a lesson for future generations. The pattern of punishment and renewal appears across these traditions with remarkable consistency. The texts do not present these catastrophes as random natural disasters, but as purposeful acts of cosmic justice. The survivors who escape the destruction are consistently described as being chosen for their wisdom, virtue, or spiritual development. They become the culture bearers who preserve fragments of the lost knowledge and transmit it to future generations. What makes these accounts particularly haunting is their description of the completeness of the destruction. The texts do not simply describe the physical obliteration of cities or even continents, but the erasure of entire ways of life, systems of knowledge, and spiritual traditions. The Egyptian texts speak of the loss of the sacred words that could command the forces of nature. The Indian texts describe the loss of the divine weapons and the knowledge of how to travel between the worlds. The Maya accounts speak of the loss of the true speech that could communicate directly with the gods. The silence that follows these catastrophes is perhaps the most disturbing element of all. The texts consistently describe periods of darkness, confusion, and wandering that follow the destruction of the great civilizations. Humanity is described as being reduced to a primitive state, forced to slowly and painfully rediscover the arts of civilization over many generations. The knowledge that is preserved is fragmentary, often distorted, and sometimes deliberately hidden to prevent its misuse. This pattern of loss and gradual recovery explains why the memory of these ancient civilizations survived primarily in mythological form. The catastrophes were so complete that direct historical records were largely destroyed, leaving only the emotional and spiritual impact of the events to be preserved in stories, songs, and religious traditions. The factual details were lost, but the essential truth, that humanity had once achieved great heights and then fallen, remained embedded in the collective memory. The transformation of history into myth appears to have been a conscious process in many cultures. The text suggests that the survivors of these catastrophes deliberately encoded their memories in symbolic form, recognizing that direct historical accounts would be vulnerable to loss or distortion over time. Myths, however, embedded in religious and cultural traditions, would be more likely to survive even the most severe social disruptions. The geographical specificity of many of these accounts adds another layer of mystery to the vanishing. The texts do not speak vaguely of somewhere in the ocean, but often provide detailed descriptions of the location, climate, and even astronomical alignments of the lost lands. The Egyptian texts place their lost western land at a specific latitude relative to the Nile Delta. The Indian texts describe the lost lands as being in the Southern Ocean, with specific references to star positions and seasonal patterns. The Maya texts provide astronomical alignments that can be dated to specific periods in the distant past. This specificity suggests that the memory of these lost civilizations was not purely mythological, but retained elements of actual geographical and historical knowledge. The fact that these specific details were preserved across thousands of years of oral tradition indicates that the events they describe were considered to be of fundamental importance to the cultures that preserved them. The recurring theme of the sea as both destroyer and preserver adds another dimension to these accounts. The ocean that swallows the lost civilizations is not simply a destructive force, but is also described as a realm where the knowledge and spirits of the lost continue to exist in a transformed state. The Egyptian texts speak of the souls of the drowned civilization continuing to exist in the Western waters, accessible to those who know the proper rituals. The Indian texts describe underwater cities where the knowledge of the previous age is preserved. The Maya accounts speak of the gods returning to the waters, from which they continue to watch over humanity. This dual nature of the sea as both graveyard and sanctuary suggests that the ancient peoples who preserved these memories understood destruction not as an ending, but as a transformation. The lost civilizations were not simply erased, but were translated into a different mode of existence, remaining accessible to those who possessed the proper knowledge and spiritual development. The gradual fading of memory over time is another consistent element in these accounts. The texts describe how the knowledge of the lost civilizations became increasingly fragmentary and distorted as the generations passed. What began as clear historical memories became increasingly mythologized, with factual details being replaced by symbolic representations. The names of places, people, and even the civilization itself were often lost, surviving only in encrypted form within religious and cultural traditions. This process of forgetting appears to have been accelerated by deliberate suppression in some cases. The texts suggest that certain knowledge was considered too dangerous to preserve in its original form, leading to its intentional encoding in symbolic language or its complete suppression. The Egyptian texts speak of certain words of power being hidden to prevent their misuse. The Indian texts describe certain weapons and technologies being deliberately forgotten to prevent their use in the current age. The Maya accounts speak of certain knowledge being hidden until humanity becomes wise enough to use it properly. The result of this process is that the memory of these lost civilizations exists in a twilight state between history and mythology, between fact and symbol. The essential truth of their existence and their destruction is preserved, but the specific details that would allow us to identify them definitively have been lost or encrypted beyond our current ability to decode them. This creates the haunting possibility that we are surrounded by the remnants of a lost golden age, but lack the key to recognize and understand them. Theories and interpretations. Decoding the silence. The mystery of these unnamed civilizations has generated numerous theories, each attempting to explain the remarkable consistency of flood myths, lost lands, and vanished peoples across cultures that seemingly had no contact with each other. These explanations range from the rigorously academic to the wildly speculative, but each offers a different lens through which to examine the evidence that has survived in ancient texts, archaeological sites, and cultural memories. The archetypal theory, favored by many anthropologists and psychologists, suggests that the similarity of these flood myths and lost civilization stories reflects universal human psychological patterns rather than shared historical experiences. According to this interpretation, all cultures develop similar mythological themes because they address fundamental human concerns. The fear of death, the anxiety about moral corruption, the longing for a golden age of harmony and perfection. The flood myth, in this view, represents a psychological cleansing, a return to primordial purity that allows for spiritual renewal and rebirth. Supporters of this theory point to the work of Carl Jung on collective unconscious and archetypes, arguing that certain symbolic patterns emerge spontaneously in human consciousness regardless of cultural contact. The island paradise that sinks beneath the waves, they argue, represents the loss of innocence that every individual and every culture experiences as they move from childhood to maturity, from simplicity to complexity, from harmony to conflict. The divine visitors who come from the sea and later depart represent the human projection of idealized parents or gods who provide perfect guidance but must eventually withdraw to allow for independent development. The archetypal interpretation explains the consistency of these myths across cultures, but it struggles to account for the specific geographical and astronomical details that many of these accounts contain. If these stories were purely psychological in origin, why would they include such precise references to star positions, seasonal patterns, and geographical coordinates? The archetypal theory also cannot easily explain why these myths were treated as historical accounts by the cultures that preserved them, rather than as symbolic stories about psychological or spiritual development. The cultural diffusion theory proposes that these similar myths reflect the spread of ideas from a common source through trade, migration, and cultural contact. According to this interpretation, there may have been a mother civilization that developed the original flood myth and lost land story, which then spread to other cultures through various forms of contact. This mother civilization might have been maritime in nature, capable of reaching distant shores and establishing trading relationships that allowed for the transmission of cultural ideas and mythological themes. Proponents of this theory point to evidence of ancient maritime trade networks that were far more extensive than previously believed. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed that ancient peoples were capable of long-distance ocean voyages much earlier than traditional history suggests. The presence of similar architectural styles, artistic motifs, and technological innovations in widely separated cultures supports the possibility of ancient cultural exchange networks. The consistency of certain mythological themes across cultures that are now separated by vast oceans might reflect the remnants of these ancient contact networks. However, the cultural diffusion theory faces significant challenges when applied to the specific case of flood myths and lost civilizations. The time depths involved in some of these traditions extend far beyond the period when we have evidence for extensive maritime contact networks. The American civilizations preserved flood myths that appear to be indigenous developments rather than borrowings from Old World cultures. The similarities between these myths often extend to specific details that would be unlikely to survive the process of cultural transmission across vast distances and time periods. The geographical theory suggests that these various myths might be describing the same actual events from different perspectives and locations. According to this interpretation, there was indeed a great civilization that was destroyed by flooding, and the various cultural traditions preserve different aspects of this single historical event. The civilization might have been island-based, explaining why it was vulnerable to sea level changes or tectonic activity. Different survivors might have reached different shores, carrying with them fragments of the original story that were then adapted to local conditions and cultural frameworks. This theory finds support in the geological evidence for dramatic sea level changes at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago. The melting of glacial ice caused sea levels to rise by hundreds of feet, flooding coastal areas and islands around the world. Low-lying civilizations that had developed during the Ice Age would have been vulnerable to this rising sea level, potentially explaining the consistency of flood myths across cultures. The specific references to Western lands in Egyptian texts, Eastern islands in Chinese chronicles, and southern seas in Indian traditions might reflect the actual geographical distribution of this lost civilization. The geographical theory also explains some of the technological and knowledge claims associated with these lost civilizations. A maritime civilization capable of global contact would necessarily have developed advanced navigation, astronomy, and engineering capabilities. The references to flying vehicles in Indian texts might reflect advanced sailing technologies that seemed magical to later observers. The references to divine weapons might describe technologies that were lost when the civilization was destroyed and their knowledge centers were flooded. Yet the geographical theory struggles to explain how a single civilization could have influenced such diverse cultures while leaving so little direct archaeological evidence. If there was indeed a global maritime civilization, we would expect to find more evidence of their presence in the archaeological record. The absence of clearly identifiable artifacts, architectural remains, or technological innovations that can be definitively linked to this hypothetical civilization raises questions about its historical reality. The astronomical theory proposes that these flood myths and lost civilization stories might be allegorical descriptions of celestial events that were witnessed by ancient peoples. Comet impacts, solar flares, or other astronomical phenomena might have been interpreted as divine punishment and incorporated into mythological narratives about the destruction of ancient civilizations. The references to gods coming from the sky and later departing might reflect the arrival and departure of comets or other celestial visitors. Supporters of this theory point to geological evidence for comet impacts and other catastrophic events that occurred around the end of the last ice age. The Younger Dryas period, approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, saw dramatic climate changes that might have been triggered by comet impacts or volcanic activity. These events would have been visible to human observers around the world and might have been incorporated into mythological narratives about divine punishment and world destruction. The astronomical theory explains the global distribution of these myths and their association with specific time periods, but it struggles to account for the detailed geographical and cultural information that many of these accounts contain. If these stories were purely allegorical descriptions of celestial events, Why would they include such specific references to island civilizations, advanced technologies, and cultural practices? The astronomical theory also cannot easily explain why these myths were consistently associated with the loss of specific knowledge and capabilities rather than simply with natural disasters. The literal theory, perhaps the most controversial, suggests that these myths preserve actual historical memories of an advanced civilization that existed in the distant past but was destroyed by natural catastrophes. According to this interpretation, the consistency of these accounts across cultures reflects their common origin in witnessed historical events. The advanced technologies and knowledge attributed to these lost civilizations might have been real capabilities that were lost when the civilization was destroyed and their knowledge centers were flooded or otherwise obliterated. Proponents of the literal theory point to recent archaeological discoveries that have pushed back the dates for the development of civilization much earlier than previously believed. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which dates to approximately 11,500 years ago, demonstrate that ancient peoples were capable of sophisticated architecture and complex symbolic systems much earlier than traditional archaeology suggested. The discovery of underwater archaeological sites around the world provides evidence that human settlements existed in areas that are now submerged, supporting the possibility that advanced civilizations might have been lost to sea level rise. The literal theory also explains the specific technological and knowledge claims associated with these lost civilizations. If these accounts preserve actual historical memories, then the references to advanced navigation, astronomy, and engineering capabilities might reflect real technologies that were developed by these ancient peoples. The loss of these capabilities following the destruction of the civilization would explain why later cultures viewed these achievements as divine or magical rather than technological. However, the literal theory faces significant challenges from the archaeological record. Despite extensive archaeological investigation, no clear evidence has been found for a global advanced civilization that existed before the traditionally accepted dates for the development of complex societies. The absence of distinctive artifacts, architectural remains, or technological innovations that can be definitively linked to such a civilization raises questions about its historical reality. The literal theory also struggles to explain how such an advanced civilization could have developed and flourished while leaving so little trace in the archaeological record. The hybrid theory, increasingly popular among researchers, suggests that these myths might reflect a combination of historical memory, cultural borrowing, and archetypal symbolism. According to this interpretation, there might have been real historical events, perhaps the destruction of early coastal civilizations by rising sea levels, that provided the historical core around which more elaborate mythological narratives developed. These core memories might have been enhanced through cultural contact, borrowing elements from other traditions, and enriched through the addition of archetypal symbols and themes that gave them deeper psychological and spiritual meaning. The hybrid theory explains both the consistency and the diversity of these myths across cultures. The historical core provides the common elements: the flood, the lost land, the advanced civilization, while cultural adaptation and archetypal elaboration explain the specific details that vary from culture to culture. This theory also explains why these myths were treated as historical accounts by the cultures that preserved them, while also accounting for their symbolic and spiritual dimensions. The question of why these civilizations remain unnamed in most accounts might reflect the completeness of their destruction. If these were indeed real historical events, the catastrophes that destroyed these civilizations might have been so thorough that even their names were lost, surviving only in the encrypted form of myth and legend. The process of transforming history into myth necessarily involves a loss of specific details in favor of symbolic meaning, explaining why we have consistent themes but few specific names, dates, or locations. The silence surrounding the true names of these lost civilizations might also reflect deliberate suppression or encoding. Ancient peoples might have intentionally obscured the specific details of these accounts to protect certain knowledge or to prevent the misuse of dangerous information. The transformation of historical accounts into mythological narratives might have been a conscious strategy for preserving essential truths, while hiding specific details that were considered too dangerous or sacred to preserve in their original form. Whatever the ultimate explanation for these remarkable similarities across cultures, the consistency of the flood myths and lost civilization stories points to something significant in human experience. Whether these accounts preserve memories of actual historical events, reflect universal psychological patterns, or represent some combination of both, they demonstrate the power of certain themes to transcend cultural boundaries and persist across vast spans of time. The mystery of their unnamed civilizations continues to challenge our understanding of human history and our assumptions about the capabilities of ancient peoples. Archaeological evidence traces beneath the waves. The search for physical evidence of these unnamed civilizations has led archaeologists to some of the most remote and challenging locations on Earth. Beneath the waves of the world's oceans, in flooded coastal areas, and in submerged landscapes that were once dry land, researchers have discovered structures and artifacts that challenge conventional timelines of human development. While none of these discoveries can be definitively linked to the lost civilizations described in ancient texts, they provide tantalizing glimpses of human presence in areas and time periods that were previously thought to be uninhabited. The Bimini Road, discovered in 1968 off the coast of the Bahamas, remains one of the most controversial underwater archaeological sites in the world. The structure consists of massive limestone blocks arranged in what appears to be a deliberate pattern, stretching for nearly half a mile along the ocean floor. The blocks are fitted together with remarkable precision, creating what looks like a road or pathway beneath the waves. Some researchers have argued that the structure is entirely natural, formed by the fracturing and weathering of limestone bedrock. Others contend that the precision of the arrangement, the uniformity of the blocks, and the apparent tooling marks on some stones suggest human construction. The controversy surrounding Bimini Road reflects the broader challenges of underwater archaeology. The marine environment is harsh and unforgiving, making detailed investigation difficult and expensive. Tidal action, storm damage, and marine growth can quickly obscure or destroy evidence of human activity. The dating of submerged structures is particularly challenging, as traditional archaeological dating methods are less reliable in marine environments. The absence of associated artifacts, pottery, tools, or other clear indicators of human presence makes it difficult to determine whether these structures are natural formations or human constructions. Near the coast of Cuba, sonar surveys have revealed what appear to be massive stone structures at depths of nearly 2,000 feet. The Cuban underwater structures, first discovered in 2001, include what appear to be pyramids, circular structures, and linear arrangements of massive stones. The extreme depth of these structures suggests that if they are indeed human constructions, they would have been built during a period when sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today. The dating implications are staggering. The structures would have to be at least 12,000 years old to have been built at current sea level, pushing back the timeline for advanced architecture by thousands of years. The Cuban discoveries have been met with skepticism from mainstream archaeology, partly due to the extraordinary claims they would require if proven to be artificial. The depth of the structures makes detailed investigation extremely difficult and expensive, limiting the amount of evidence that can be gathered. The few images that have been obtained show formations that could be interpreted as either natural rock formations or human constructions, depending on one's perspective. The absence of clear artifact assemblages or other unambiguous evidence of human activity has led many archaeologists to suspend judgment pending more detailed investigation. Off the coast of India, the submerged city of Dvarka has provided some of the most compelling evidence for advanced ancient civilizations beneath the waves. The site, located in the Gulf of Cambay, contains the remains of what appears to be a substantial urban settlement, with walls, streets, and structures that clearly show evidence of human construction. The discovery of pottery, tools, and other artifacts in association with the structures provides clear evidence of human habitation. Carbon dating of organic materials from the site has yielded dates of approximately 9,000 years, making it one of the oldest known urban settlements in the world. The Dvarka site corresponds closely with descriptions in ancient Hindu texts of the Golden City of Krishna, which was said to have been swallowed by the ocean after Krishna's departure from the earth. The correspondence between the textual descriptions and the archaeological evidence provides a rare example of ancient accounts that may be based on actual historical events rather than purely mythological narratives. The discovery has led to renewed interest in the historical reliability of ancient Indian texts and has challenged conventional assumptions about the antiquity of urban civilization in the Indian subcontinent. The underwater structures at Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan, represent perhaps the most extensively studied and controversial underwater archaeological site in the world. The Yonaguni Monument, discovered in 1987, consists of massive stone formations that appear to have been carved and shaped by human hands. The structure includes what appear to be steps, platforms, walls, and even carved faces, all executed with a precision that suggests advanced stoneworking capabilities. The formations are cut from solid bedrock, indicating that they were carved in place rather than assembled from transported stones. The Yonaguni Monument has been the subject of intense debate among archaeologists and geologists. Some researchers argue that the formations are entirely natural, created by the fracturing and weathering of sedimentary rock layers. They point to the regular layering of the rock and the natural tendency of this type of stone to fracture along geometric planes. Others contend that the precision and complexity of the formations, including apparent tool marks and carved details, indicate deliberate human construction. The presence of what appear to be steps, platforms, and drainage channels suggests a level of planning and execution that would be difficult to explain as purely natural phenomena. The dating of the Yonaguni Monument presents the same challenges as other underwater archaeological sites. If the structure is indeed human-made, it would have been carved when the area was above sea level, requiring it to be at least 12,000 years old. This would place its construction far earlier than the conventional timeline for advanced stoneworking capabilities in the region. The absence of clear artifact assemblages or other evidence of human habitation in the area during the proposed construction period has led many archaeologists to remain skeptical of the human origin theory. The challenges of underwater archaeology extend beyond the physical difficulties of working in marine environments. The interpretation of underwater structures requires expertise in both archaeology and marine geology, as natural processes can create formations that appear artificial to untrained observers. The absence of clear cultural contexts, the artifact assemblages, settlement patterns, and other evidence that normally accompany human construction makes it difficult to distinguish between natural formations and human constructions. The extreme ages that would be required for many of these structures, if they are indeed artificial, challenges conventional understanding of human technological development. The discovery of underwater archaeological sites around the world has revealed the extent to which human settlements have been lost to sea level change. During the last ice age, sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than they are today, exposing vast areas of the continental shelf that are now submerged. Coastal settlements that developed during this period would have been flooded as the ice melted and sea levels rose. The process of sea level rise was not gradual but occurred in rapid pulses, with some areas being flooded within a matter of decades or centuries. The implications of these discoveries extend beyond the specific sites themselves. If advanced civilizations did exist in coastal areas during the last ice age, their remains would now be buried beneath hundreds of feet of water and sediment. The archaeological record for early human civilization would be fundamentally incomplete, missing entire chapters of human development that occurred in areas that are now inaccessible to conventional archaeological investigation. The bias toward inland and highland sites in the archaeological record might give us a distorted picture of early human capabilities and achievements. The technological requirements for investigating underwater archaeological sites have limited the extent of research that can be conducted. Deep-sea archaeology requires specialized equipment, trained personnel, and substantial funding, making it accessible only to a small number of research institutions. The harsh marine environment means that investigation windows are limited, and the documentation of sites must be completed quickly before conditions deteriorate. The absence of extensive underwater archaeological programs means that many potential sites remain uninvestigated or only partially explored. The interpretation of underwater archaeological evidence is further complicated by the lack of comparative sites and contexts. Unlike terrestrial archaeology, where new discoveries can be compared with extensive databases of known sites and artifact assemblages, underwater archaeology operates with a much smaller sample size. The absence of clear developmental sequences and cultural contexts makes it difficult to place underwater discoveries within broader patterns of human development. Each site must be evaluated largely on its own merits, without the benefit of comparative analysis that guides terrestrial archaeology. The potential for natural mimicry of human construction in marine environments adds another layer of complexity to underwater archaeological interpretation. Wave action, tidal forces, and chemical weathering can create formations that appear artificial to casual observers. The regular fracturing of sedimentary rocks can create structures that resemble walls, steps, and platforms. The differential weathering of rock layers can create formations that appear to be carved or shaped. Distinguishing between natural formations and human constructions requires careful analysis of construction techniques, tool marks, and association with clear cultural materials. Despite these challenges, the growing body of underwater archaeological evidence continues to expand our understanding of human presence in areas and time periods that were previously thought to be uninhabited. The discovery of settlement sites, artifact assemblages, and possibly constructed features in submerged landscapes demonstrates that human populations were more widely distributed and possibly more technologically advanced than conventional archaeology suggests. While none of these discoveries can be definitively linked to the lost civilizations described in ancient texts, they provide evidence that the human story is more complex and ancient than traditional narratives acknowledge. The silence of these underwater sites, their absence from historical records, and their separation from living cultural traditions mirrors the silence surrounding the unnamed civilizations described in ancient texts. Like the mythological accounts, these archaeological discoveries suggest the existence of human achievements that have been lost to time and natural catastrophe. Whether these sites represent the physical remains of the civilizations described in ancient myths, or whether they simply demonstrate the general principle that human achievements can be lost to rising seas and changing climates, they remind us that the archaeological record is incomplete and that our understanding of human history continues to evolve as new evidence emerges from beneath the waves. Mysteries, legends, and esoteric explanations. Beyond the realm of conventional archaeology and historical analysis lies a shadowy world of esoteric traditions, folk memories, and mystical interpretations that offer alternative explanations for the unnamed civilizations that haunt ancient texts. These accounts, dismissed by mainstream scholarship as folklore or fantasy, preserve details and perspectives that sometimes illuminate aspects of the mystery that more orthodox approaches cannot address. The persistence of these traditions across cultures and centuries suggests that they may contain fragments of truth embedded within layers of symbolic interpretation and mystical speculation. The indigenous peoples of the Americas have preserved oral traditions that speak of visitors from across the waters who brought knowledge of agriculture, astronomy, and sacred architecture. The Hopi prophecies describe the emergence of humanity through previous worlds, each of which was destroyed when its inhabitants became corrupt and forgot their spiritual obligations. The current world, according to Hopi tradition, is the fourth world, and like its predecessors, it too will be destroyed if humanity fails to maintain its spiritual balance. The prophecies speak of a time when the great purification will come, returning the world to its original state of harmony. These prophecies are not presented as abstract spiritual teachings, but as historical accounts of actual events that occurred in the distant past and that will occur again in the future. The Hopi describe the destruction of the previous worlds in terms that closely parallel the flood myths of other cultures. Great waters that covered the earth, the sinking of entire continents, and the survival of only a few individuals who carried the knowledge of the previous age into the new world. The consistency of these accounts with similar traditions from around the world suggests that they may preserve memories of actual historical events rather than purely mythological narratives. The Celtic traditions of Ireland and Britain preserve memories of the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Dana, who were said to have come from 4 mystical islands in the north of the world. These divine beings brought with them 4 magical treasures that represented the mastery of the elements and the knowledge of divine principles. They ruled Ireland for a time before retreating to the otherworld, where they continue to exist as the immortal guardians of sacred knowledge. The accounts describe the Tuatha De Danann as possessing advanced knowledge of healing, prophecy, and the manipulation of natural forces. The retreat of the Tuatha De Danann to the otherworld parallels the departure of the divine teachers described in other traditions. Like the gods of the Maya who returned to the waters, or the Neteru of Egypt who withdrew to the celestial realms, the Tuatha De Danann represent a golden age of divine guidance that ended when humanity was no longer ready to receive direct instruction from the gods. The Celtic tradition preserves the belief that this knowledge is not lost but hidden, accessible to those who possess the proper spiritual development and ritual knowledge. The Polynesian traditions speak of Mu, the lost continent of the Pacific, which was said to have been the original homeland of the Polynesian peoples. According to these accounts, Mu was a vast landmass that existed in the Pacific Ocean and was home to an advanced civilization that possessed knowledge of navigation, astronomy, and spiritual practices that allowed them to maintain harmony with the natural world. The continent was destroyed by a great catastrophe, possibly a volcanic eruption or earthquake, that caused it to sink beneath the waves. The survivors of this catastrophe became the ancestors of the Polynesian peoples, carrying with them fragments of the original knowledge that enabled them to navigate the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. The Polynesian accounts of Mu are not presented as religious mythology, but as historical traditions that explain the origins of the Polynesian peoples and their unique capabilities in ocean navigation. The consistency of these accounts across the widely dispersed Polynesian cultures suggests that they may preserve memories of actual historical events rather than purely mythological narratives. The advanced navigational knowledge of the Polynesian peoples, which enabled them to traverse thousands of miles of open ocean using only traditional methods, lends credibility to the possibility that they inherited this knowledge from an earlier maritime civilization. The esoteric traditions of Egypt preserve accounts of the Zep Tepi, the first time when the Neteru or gods ruled directly on Earth. These accounts describe a golden age when divine beings possessed complete knowledge of the natural world and could manipulate matter and energy through the power of consciousness. The Neteru are described as having built the great monuments of Egypt using technologies that were later lost, leaving only fragments of their knowledge to be preserved in the temple traditions. The decline of this golden age is attributed to the gradual loss of spiritual consciousness among humanity, leading to the withdrawal of the gods and the beginning of the current age of material struggle. The Egyptian temple traditions preserve detailed accounts of the knowledge possessed by the Neteru, including the mastery of healing, the ability to communicate with natural forces, and the knowledge of the sacred geometry that underlies the structure of reality. These accounts are not presented as abstract spiritual teachings, but as practical knowledge that was once widely available but has been lost due to the spiritual decline of humanity. The temple traditions maintain that this knowledge is not permanently lost, but can be recovered through proper spiritual development and initiation into the ancient mysteries. The Vedic traditions of India preserve accounts of the Devas, the Shining Ones, who possessed knowledge of technologies that seem almost magical by modern standards. The ancient Sanskrit texts describe flying vehicles called vimanas, weapons that could destroy entire armies, and cities that existed in the sky or beneath the waters. These accounts are presented not as fantasy but as historical descriptions of capabilities that existed in previous ages but were lost when humanity became spiritually corrupt. The Vedic texts describe cyclic ages in which humanity alternately rises to great heights of spiritual and technological achievement and then falls into periods of darkness and ignorance. The Vedic accounts of the previous ages describe civilizations that possessed knowledge of genetic engineering, atomic energy, and consciousness-based technologies that operated through the power of sound and intention. These technologies were lost when humanity became selfish and began to use them for purposes of conquest and domination rather than for the benefit of all life. The destruction of these civilizations is described as both a natural consequence of their spiritual corruption and a divine intervention to prevent the misuse of dangerous technologies. The Gnostic traditions of the Mediterranean world preserve accounts of the archons, beings who are said to have corrupted the original divine plan for humanity and imprisoned human consciousness in a false reality. According to these accounts, humanity originally possessed direct knowledge of divine truth and the ability to communicate with the spiritual realms. This knowledge was lost when the archons intervened, creating a false reality that obscured the true nature of existence and trapped humanity in cycles of ignorance and suffering. The Gnostic traditions maintain that this original knowledge can be recovered through spiritual practices that restore the connection between human consciousness and the divine source. The Gnostic accounts describe the original state of humanity as one of spiritual awareness and direct communion with divine consciousness. The loss of this state is attributed to the intervention of forces that sought to control and manipulate human consciousness for their own purposes. The Gnostic traditions preserve detailed accounts of the methods by which this original knowledge can be recovered, including meditation practices, ritual techniques, and ethical principles that can restore the connection between human consciousness and the divine source. The Hermetic traditions preserve accounts of Atlantis as a civilization that possessed complete knowledge of the correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm, the ability to manipulate matter through consciousness, and the understanding of the spiritual principles that govern the physical world. According to these accounts, Atlantis was destroyed not by natural catastrophe but by the misuse of spiritual knowledge for purposes of power and domination. The destruction of Atlantis is described as both a punishment for spiritual corruption and a protection of the sacred knowledge from further misuse. The Hermetic accounts describe the knowledge possessed by the Atlanteans as including the mastery of alchemy, the ability to transmute matter through spiritual processes, and the understanding of the sacred geometry that underlies the structure of reality. This knowledge was preserved in fragments by the survivors of Atlantis, who became the teachers of the ancient mystery schools. The Hermetic traditions maintain that this knowledge is still available to those who possess the proper spiritual development and initiation into the ancient mysteries. The Sufi traditions of Islam preserve accounts of the Abdul, hidden saints who possess complete spiritual knowledge and who work invisibly to maintain the spiritual balance of the world. According to these accounts, the Abdul are the inheritors of the original divine knowledge that was possessed by humanity before the fall into spiritual ignorance. They exist in every age, working to preserve and transmit the sacred knowledge to those who are ready to receive it. The Sufi traditions describe the Abdul as possessing knowledge of the inner dimensions of reality and the ability to operate in multiple levels of consciousness simultaneously. The Sufi accounts describe the original state of humanity as one of spiritual perfection and direct communion with divine consciousness. The loss of this state is attributed to the gradual development of the ego and the identification with the material world rather than the spiritual source. The Sufi traditions preserve detailed accounts of the methods by which this original knowledge can be recovered, including dhikr, remembrance of God, meditation practices, and the cultivation of spiritual qualities that restore the connection between human consciousness and the divine source. The Native American traditions preserve accounts of the Star People, beings who came from the sky and taught humanity the arts of civilization. According to these accounts, the Star People possessed knowledge of healing, agriculture, and astronomy that they shared with humanity during a golden age of harmony and spiritual development. The Star People are described as having physical forms that were similar to but more refined than human beings, and as possessing technologies that operated through the power of consciousness rather than mechanical principles. The departure of the Star People is attributed to the spiritual decline of humanity and the misuse of the knowledge that they had shared. The Native American traditions preserve the belief that the Star People will return when humanity has developed the spiritual maturity to use their knowledge wisely. The consistency of these accounts across diverse Native American cultures suggests that they may preserve memories of actual historical events rather than purely mythological narratives. The Tibetan traditions preserve accounts of Shambhala, the hidden kingdom that exists in a dimension parallel to the physical world. According to these accounts, Shambhala is inhabited by beings who have achieved complete spiritual development and who possess knowledge of the inner principles that govern the physical world. The kingdom is described as being accessible only to those who have attained a high level of spiritual development and who have been properly initiated into the ancient mysteries. The Tibetan accounts describe Shambhala as preserving the complete knowledge of the original golden age of humanity, including the understanding of the relationship between consciousness and matter, the ability to manipulate the physical world through spiritual means, and the knowledge of the cycles of cosmic evolution. This knowledge is said to be preserved in Shambhala until humanity develops the spiritual maturity to use it wisely, at which time the kingdom will reveal itself and share its knowledge with the world. These esoteric traditions, while varying in their specific details and cultural contexts, share common themes that parallel the unnamed civilizations described in ancient texts. They speak of golden ages when humanity possessed advanced knowledge and spiritual capabilities, the loss of this knowledge due to spiritual corruption, and the preservation of fragments of the original wisdom in hidden or encoded form. They suggest that the mystery of the unnamed civilizations is not simply a matter of historical curiosity, but represents a fundamental aspect of human spiritual development and the cyclical nature of consciousness evolution. The persistence of these traditions across cultures and centuries suggests that they may preserve important truths about human potential and the nature of consciousness that have been lost to mainstream understanding. Whether these accounts represent memories of actual historical events, symbolic descriptions of spiritual principles, or some combination of both. They offer perspectives on the mystery of the unnamed civilizations that complement and sometimes illuminate the more conventional approaches of archaeology and historical analysis. The silence surrounding the true names of these lost civilizations takes on new meaning when viewed through the lens of esoteric tradition. The absence of specific historical details may not represent a failure of memory or evidence, but a deliberate encoding of sacred knowledge in symbolic form. The transformation of history into myth may have been a conscious process designed to preserve essential truths while protecting them from misuse or corruption. The unnamed civilizations may remain unnamed not because their names were lost, but because their true nature transcends the limitations of historical identification and can only be understood through direct spiritual experience. Conclusion: the echoes of the unnamed. As we reach the end of our journey through 10 ancient texts and the shadows they cast across human memory, we find ourselves confronting a mystery that seems to grow deeper rather than clearer with each piece of evidence we examine. The unnamed civilizations that haunt these accounts remain elusive, their true nature suspended between history and mythology, between fact and symbol, between the tangible world of archaeological evidence and the ethereal realm of collective memory. We have traversed the flood myths of diverse cultures, examined the archaeological evidence hidden beneath the waves, and explored the esoteric traditions that preserve alternative perspectives on these lost worlds. Each approach has revealed different facets of the mystery, but none has provided the definitive answer that would allow us to identify these civilizations with certainty. The silence that surrounds their true names seems to be not merely an absence of evidence, but a fundamental characteristic of their nature, as if they exist in a realm where ordinary historical categories break down and cease to apply. The consistency of these accounts across cultures that had no known contact with each other remains one of the most compelling aspects of the mystery. The flood myths, the descriptions of advanced civilizations, the accounts of divine teachers who came from the waters and later departed, these themes appear with such regularity that they suggest something more than mere coincidence or cultural borrowing. Whether they represent memories of actual historical events, expressions of universal psychological patterns, or some combination of both, they point to experiences that were sufficiently profound to become embedded in the collective memory of humanity. The archaeological evidence, while tantalizing, remains frustratingly incomplete. The underwater structures at Yonaguni, Bimini, and other sites around the world provide glimpses of human presence in areas and time periods that challenge conventional understanding of human development. Yet the marine environment has been harsh to these potential remnants of ancient civilization, obscuring their true nature and making definitive interpretation difficult. The absence of clear cultural contexts, the artifact assemblages, settlement patterns, and other evidence that normally accompany human construction leaves us with structures that could be interpreted as either natural formations or human constructions, depending on one's perspective and criteria for evaluation. The esoteric traditions offer a different lens through which to view the mystery, suggesting that the unnamed civilizations may represent aspects of human potential and consciousness development that transcend ordinary historical categories. These traditions speak of golden ages when humanity possessed advanced knowledge and spiritual capabilities, the loss of this knowledge due to spiritual corruption, and the preservation of fragments of the original wisdom in hidden or encoded form. They suggest that the mystery of the unnamed civilizations is not simply a matter of historical curiosity, but represents a fundamental aspect of human spiritual development and the cyclical nature of consciousness evolution. The theories that attempt to explain the consistency of these accounts across cultures each capture certain aspects of the mystery while leaving others unexplained. The archetypal theory explains the psychological resonance of these stories, but struggles to account for their specific geographical and astronomical details. The cultural diffusion theory explains the spread of similar themes across cultures, but cannot easily account for the time depths and geographical distributions involved. The geographical theory explains the consistency of flood myths, but struggles with the absence of clear archaeological evidence for a global maritime civilization. The astronomical theory explains the timing of these accounts, but cannot account for their detailed cultural and technological content. Perhaps the most intriguing possibility is that these theories are not mutually exclusive but represent different aspects of a more complex reality. The unnamed civilizations may represent a convergence of historical memory, psychological archetype, and spiritual symbol that transcends ordinary categories of interpretation. They may be simultaneously real and mythological, historical and archetypal, material and spiritual. The mystery of their unnamed nature may reflect not a failure of memory or evidence, but a fundamental characteristic of experiences that operate at the intersection of ordinary consciousness and deeper levels of reality. The silence that surrounds the true names of these civilizations may be the most significant clue to their nature. In many spiritual traditions, true names are considered to have power, and the most sacred realities are often referred to only indirectly or through symbolic language. The unnamed civilizations may remain unnamed not because their names were lost, but because their true nature transcends the limitations of ordinary language and historical identification. They may exist in a realm where naming would diminish rather than illuminate their essential nature. The transformation of history into myth, which appears to be a consistent pattern in these accounts, may represent a conscious process of encoding sacred knowledge in symbolic form. The specific details of historical events may have been deliberately obscured or transformed to preserve essential truths while protecting them from misuse or corruption. The unnamed civilizations may have been deliberately anonymized to prevent their specific technologies, knowledge, or spiritual practices from being misappropriated by those who lacked the wisdom to use them properly. The cyclical nature of these accounts, describing repeated golden ages followed by catastrophic destruction, may reflect not just historical patterns but fundamental principles of consciousness evolution. The rise and fall of civilizations may represent cycles of spiritual development in which humanity alternately achieves great heights of knowledge and awareness, and then falls into periods of darkness and ignorance. The unnamed civilizations may represent archetypal patterns that manifest repeatedly throughout human history, each time appearing in different forms but preserving the same essential characteristics. The global distribution of these accounts suggests that the experiences they describe were not limited to specific geographical regions or cultural groups, but represent universal aspects of human development. The flood myths, the accounts of divine teachers, the descriptions of lost knowledge, these themes appear in cultures from every continent and every historical period. This universality suggests that the unnamed civilizations may represent not specific historical entities but archetypal patterns that reflect fundamental aspects of human consciousness and its relationship to the divine. The technological and spiritual capabilities attributed to these civilizations may represent not impossible fantasies but forgotten potentials of human consciousness. The accounts of flying vehicles, advanced weapons, and consciousness-based technologies may preserve memories of capabilities that were once accessible to humanity, but were lost when spiritual development declined. The esoteric traditions maintain that these capabilities are not permanently lost, but can be recovered through proper spiritual development and initiation into the ancient mysteries. The moral dimension of these accounts, which consistently attribute the destruction of these civilizations to spiritual corruption and the misuse of knowledge, may represent not just historical patterns but universal principles of spiritual development. The unnamed civilizations may serve as cautionary tales, reminding us that knowledge without wisdom, technology without spiritual development, and power without compassion inevitably lead to destruction. They may represent both the promise and the peril of human potential, showing us what we might achieve and warning us of what we might lose. The mystery of the unnamed civilizations ultimately reflects the mystery of human consciousness itself. Like these lost worlds, human consciousness operates at the intersection of the material and the spiritual, the historical and the archetypal, the known and the unknown. The search for the unnamed civilizations may be simultaneously a search for our own forgotten potential, our own lost capabilities, our own deeper nature that has been obscured by the limitations of ordinary consciousness and historical perspective. As we conclude our exploration of these ancient texts and the shadows they cast across human memory, we are left not with answers but with deeper questions. The unnamed civilizations remain unnamed, their true nature suspended between history and mythology, between fact and symbol. Perhaps this is as it should be. Perhaps the mystery is more important than the solution, the search more valuable than the finding. Perhaps the unnamed civilizations exist not to be discovered but to be remembered, not to be identified but to be recognized as aspects of our own deepest nature and highest potential. The echoes of the unnamed continue to reverberate through human consciousness, calling us to remember what we have forgotten, to recover what we have lost, to become what we have always been capable of being. In the end, The mystery of the unnamed civilizations may be the mystery of consciousness itself, eternal, archetypal, and forever beyond the reach of ordinary understanding, yet always present in the depths of human memory and the heights of human aspiration. The silence that surrounds their true names may be the silence of the sacred, the unnamed reality that underlies all naming, the source from which all civilizations arise and to which all must ultimately return. Whether these civilizations existed in historical fact or only in the realm of symbol and archetype, their influence on human consciousness remains undeniable. They continue to inspire us to reach beyond the limitations of ordinary understanding, to seek the knowledge that transcends the boundaries of time and culture, to remember the golden age that may have been and the golden age that may yet be. In this remembering, in this seeking, in this reaching beyond the known into the unknown, we may find not the unnamed civilizations themselves, but something even more precious, the unnamed potential within ourselves that connects us to the eternal mystery of consciousness and the infinite possibility of human becoming.